Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahe Tejasvinavaditam Astoma Vidvishavai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May that one protect us both. May that one nourish us both. May we work together with great vigor. May our study be fully illumined. May we not unnecessarily cavil or disagree with each other. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. So welcome everybody. Just to ensure that you understand that this will be broadcast live on YouTube. And so if you want to protect your privacy, just to make sure that your camera is off. Very often religions, particularly when a child is inquiring where is God, will point to an external creator God. That is that there's a controlling element that stands outside us. But there's a very useful passage in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad that tells us to look inside. It uses a very peculiar term called Antaryaman. Antaryaman, the thing that controls from within, the inner controller. And shortly, a while ago, we did a meditation on this subject, inner controller. And what it means that in meditation, there can be no distractions. We can adopt a certain formula that takes any object before our eyes or ears and trace it back, dive down deep, removing every layer, thinking that God is there in costumes, a number of different costumes, and we can peel away the layers until we ultimately get to an entity that is an inner controller. Inner controller means an entity that has a willing aspect, a powerful aspect, a knowing aspect. And when we say that or think that God is an intelligent designer, that is incorporated into it by that entity's presence and weaving some kind of cocoon around itself, some room, as it were, around itself, and then occupying it. It is there for a purpose and gives a function to the housing that it stands in. So whatever comes to mind can be taken during meditation, not as a disturbance, but we can analyze it a little bit and find out the God that is at the center of it. And then we can say, next one please, next one please. Take a flower and offer it and let it go, and then take the next one. Do that, and again open that up. We can do it down to the very rock bottom where you can see God himself as an inner controller. Do that with any object that comes. Analyze it to its root, and don't stop till you see God there, till you feel God there. And then say, Lord, I have gone through all your costumes, and I find that you alone is there. There's no disturbance. There's only a manifested form that you happen to occupy. And that makes you an inner controller, an Antaryaman. Now this is found in a teaching by Yajnavalkya, but it's related to a kind of story. We can say the story in brief, that the great sage King Janaka, he held court, and he held some kind of sacrifice, and he gave many presents. They were available there. And we'll find this in the 3rd chapter of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. This is the preamble to the story. And so he offered 1,000 cows, cows being the wealth of the day, to anybody who was the wisest and who could answer all the questions. And these 1,000 cows, that's a large quantity. Of course, cows will ultimately get old. Their milk would dry and so on. So he attached some gold coins or some gold or silver to the horns of these animals to look after them when they went dry. And he said then, "O venerable, learned ones, let him who is the wisest knower of Brahman among you take away these cows." And these Brahmanas, of course, didn't dare do anything, didn't dare say anything, because it would not be the sign of a wise person to say, "I'm wise, let me take the cows." But Yajnavalkya, with a sense of fun, says to his students, "Come on, come take the cows now." There was a big uproar. "You say you're the wisest?" And Yajnavalkya turns it back on them and says, "Well, my dear fellows, if you think that I'm not, then prove it." They put the burden of proof on them. That led to a whole series of questions. Now, the background to one of those questions was like this, that in a certain house, there was the teacher's wife was possessed by a ghost, and he asked the teacher and the students 2 questions. So the first question was a very sweeping question. Do you know that thread, that connection that ties together this world and the next? There must be some connectedness somewhere. Something like asking in physics, do you have a theory of everything? Do you have a fundamental force that binds everything together? Some kind of energy that when we know it, we can see everything is fully bound and connected. We take the whole of the universe and all its objects within it. What holds them in place? Of course, many forces hold them in place, but is there one central one that we can highlight? So that was the first question. A very sweeping question. And when we say all creatures, in these ancient days, it was thought of all creatures being something like a womb of all beings, a kind of origin, a kind of creator was included in it as an objective being, down to a clump of grass. That's how it was described. But the second question then, so apart from things being strung together like a thread stringing a garland of flowers together, the next question is, do you know that inner controller? And here we find this expression, Antarayaman, who controls this and the next life and all beings from within. So these are very subtle questions because neither the teachers nor the students knew the answer. And so this question, these 2 questions come up again, and they come to Yajnavalkya. And so the major portion of the teaching in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad will be the teaching from this Yajnavalkya. So, since nobody claimed the cows and Yajnavalkya claimed him, he was under the firing line. These 2 questions came. Just to repeat the first one, what is that thread, that connecting link that holds together this world and the next world and all creatures from Brahma to a clump of grass? And Yajnavalkya's reply was very simple. He describes it in this way, Vayu. That is a kind of life force without which the lungs don't move. When the life force leaves the body, we say that their body is dead. So the body is dependent on some supporting life form, and that must be the life form for the whole of the universe as well. Something called energy. In Western countries, the term energy and the concept of it was only known from about 1840. But in the ancient days in India, they knew this concept, variously called Vayu, Prana, essentially that pure energy that strings everything together. So that principle which makes this life possible. When the energy that makes the air go in and go out of the lungs, makes the diaphragm move, acts as a support for action, reaction, selection, absorption. That's that entity that connects everything together. But the answer to the second question is much more subtle, is more difficult. What is that inner controller? And it's a very useful passage because it allows us to take a number of different approaches, starting from the earth, to fire, to water, to all the elements, to the eyes, the ears, everything that we can observe, everything in front of us and around us. And to take each individual item and imagine how it was before it existed. And so that is how the dialogue goes. And because it's an important passage, all these examples are repeated, and each one can be used for meditation purposes. So let us take what is the first one. See, when I see everything in front, human, creature, animal, bird, fish, tree, earth, sun, moon, stars, or even certain principles that are called the Mahavakya, the Mahabhutas, the great elements, the subtle elements. When I can see all of these things, can I then find out layer after layer what is inside of them and what was there before they existed? Let's take, for example, the earth. There must have been a time when the earth wasn't here. And we can use some imagination and think, before the earth was here, what was there? A kind of space. But it was being occupied by an entity that clearly had a designing element to it. That entity, by its will, by its power, by its movement, that entity had the capacity, as it were, to weave a cocoon around itself, weave a body around itself. And in weaving that body around itself, and we can imagine how it was, it could be that fiery gas came, a kind of plasma, and then a magnetic force set up that made an iron core, and then all solidified and settled down. And the earth then became a spinning thing, a revolving thing, exactly the right distance from the sun. We can't say with ease that it all just happened haphazardly. You can imagine that there is this inner controller within it. That means that the earth becomes its body. And we can do that with every single item. So that becomes a kind of a meditation where we can take any object we like and resolve it to its source by thinking that there's some kind of internal controller, not external controller. And this is where Vedanta and science agrees. Nothing happens from outside, it's all from inside. You may think that the environment, the earth, sunshine, air, etc., around a flower is what makes the flower grow. No, not necessarily. There's something within it that makes the growth happen from within. Let's take, for example, a tree that stands for maybe 200-300 years. I don't suppose you and I can stand like that with our arms up, as a tree does, and not get tired. A tree does it. And underneath it, below the ground, there is a root. If you came from Mars, you wouldn't suspect that there was a root like that underneath the ground. So these are some clues. And without the root, there's no tree. But the whole thing is occupied. And so the answer goes very much like this. He who dwells in the earth, says Yajnavalkya in answer to this question, yet is within the earth, whom the earth does not know. Why would the earth know you are sitting within a building? It's not the business of the building to know it. You are the occupier of the building. You are the person who has the capacity to clean it or sit in it or do whatever you like in it. So the building itself is insentient, it doesn't know. Whose body the earth is. The Lord's body is there. There's a biblical passage that the earth is the Lord's footstool. You can imagine it like that. Who controls the earth from within? He is who? Not only the self of the earth, but he's put it as The self, the inner controller, the immortal. That is, he was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. That's St. John's Gospel also. This earth can support many things, but he entered into it. He couldn't stay outside it. He was inside it, just sitting there like sitting in a room. And then we go to the next one. So he who inhabits the earth, just to recap, but is within it, whom the earth does not know, whose body is the earth, and who controls the earth from within. He is the inner, the internal ruler, that is controller, your own immortal self. Not sitting in a heaven, not an extra cosmic creator entity sitting there, dictating and ruling and creating from above. It's all from within. Swami Vivekananda, in his Raja Yoga, makes it very, very clear. There is nothing that happens from outside. Religion might say an angel created it. But science will say no. It happens from within. The energy is from within. There's nothing from outside. And Vedanta will also say that. And Vedanta is the science of philosophy, will also declare it. So it happens from within. So that was the reply, number one, earth. But you can take any example that is on the earth, such as a tree, imagining that something like a tree was a body woven around that inner controller, standing there, sucking nourishment up from the soil, distributing it to leaves, having the capacity to take the energy from the sun. So lending its sentiency and its rulership to it, controlling it from within, in other words. Making it its home for the time being. One special feature about the earth is that without an abundance of water, there's no life. And water makes liquid. That is, makes a liquidity. The cells of the body have their flexibility on account of the fluid inside, mainly water. The body is something like 70% and odd water. Without the water, there's no body, there's no life. We can see how precious water is and water resources are. So that is the next item that is taken. The water that makes the body so elastic enough to function, so that I can move my hand. That entity called water is because there's an inner control within it, inside it. So he goes to the next item. So he says, he who dwells in the water, yet is within the water, whom the water does not know, whose body the water is, who controls the water from within. He is yourself, the inner controller, the immortal. This is stated over and over again in some 26 passages. You may say that's a little boring, but when you look at it in great detail, it becomes a meditation. It becomes a wonderful formula that when you practice it with eyes open, assessing every object, you'll react differently to it. Because you'll see that beyond and within all the layers, everything that you see is registered as a kind of housing, and the inner controller sits inside, controlling it from within. Then the fire is taken next. He who dwells in the fire, yet is within the fire, whom the fire does not know, whose body the fire is, who controls the fire from within. He is yourself, the inner controller, the immortal. Fire is one of the most ancient discoveries of man. It changed our whole dietary constitution. It allowed us to sit around the fire and tell stories, gaze into the fire and get some inspiration. It allowed us to do activities beyond the daylight. And we take it for granted. But we can take fire as an element, and we find it in everywhere. We find it in the human body as digestive fire. That entity that makes a consistent temperature, whether you live in the Arctic Circle or equatorial Africa. Body temperature is about the same, 38 degrees and odd. And when two sticks are rubbed together, when you take one piece of hardwood, You drill a hole somewhere, and then you take another piece of wood and you rub it. You make a good friction, you put some tinder there, you get a spark and you blow. Within the wood is the fire, and within the fire is this entity, the inner controller, arranging everything nicely. Applying all this to philosophy then, this withinness is compatible with common sense. It's also compatible with philosophy, the science of this, all the sciences which say that it must be within, everything must be controlled within. The environment is only a feeding thing. It is not the actual entity that makes the thing grow. So the next example, fire, he who abides in that, and then he who sits in the interspace, antiraksha. You may look up into space or down into space, whichever you prefer, look all around. You may see a blank. But in that blank, an electromagnetic field operates. All kinds of waves are there, gamma rays, X-rays, smell waves, heat waves, sound waves, radio waves, photons, all kinds of things in the electromagnetic wave system operating at different frequencies. And none of them know this inner controller. It's not their job to know it, because they operate as a housing. And within that, making everything move, is this inner controller. So he who dwells in this interspace, yet is within it, when this doesn't know it, whose body this entity is, who controls this from within, he is yourself. Repeated formula. Now, it's not that he is the self of the electromagnetic wave system or the void or the interspace. You see how it's phrased? It's your own immortal self, as much as anywhere else. It's the same self in everything else. We come to that unity of understanding. And he who uses air also. When your tire goes flat in your car, the air agrees to get molded into the shape of your tire. It's pushed in. God agrees to be pumped to that position, and his internal principle supports you also. You're here because of certain pressure. And all around you, that air is. And air has a characteristic of having no boundaries. It's in and out, inside and outside. So that comes as life. And that air is responsible also for food, for the lungs moving in and out, for all the chemical components within the air to make life, and all the atmosphere that creates conditions. All of that is there, and that is the inner controller. Once more, the formula is given. That entity sits in every cell of the body also, making sure that things operate correctly even while you sleep, and gives you expenditure for use of hating people and everything else, and trying to kill them and all the rest of it. And mind, day after day, life after life, he does it, giving you pocket money for thinking. He is that inner controller within it, that which is behind all thought, behind the mind, abiding inside it, and then inside the sun. Sun is a life giver, aditya it's called. He who made the sun as a kind of cocoon around himself. And no doubt in course of time he will disintegrate it. But he's operating it from within. Something like a remote control. A crane can transfer materials 100 stories up. It's not part of the building. And the building doesn't really know it. Something like that is operating from within, not from outside. That's the point. Over and over again it's repeated. So he whom the sun cannot burn or illumine, he who operates the sun from within, again he is your inner controller, not only of the sun but in you, your own immortal self. And then all the directions, wherever you look, north, south, east, west, in every direction, up and down, That entity is there. It's called Dikshu, in what you call space itself, in every direction, totally abiding in space, but not forming part of it. And he whose space cannot move or operate on. If I say fool from here, and there are 8 to 10 hills, they'll all echo fool, fool back at me. So whatever thought I put out, whatever movement I make, that inner controller gives it back to me 100-fold. According to the things that echo your movements, you'll get compound interest on it. And he controls space from within. He is your inner controller, your own immortal self. See, if we look at the apparent motion of the sun from east to west, rotating in 24 parts, you can divide it up into 60 and odd. And you can say also that 27 solar days make a lunar month. And you can say that 12 of that, 12 minutes and 27 star spaces, that kind of time and that kind of space is giving 2.5 star spaces, if you want, for 1 month. 30 degrees space or transfer between areas divided by 9 parts. 27 constellations act as time markers with the moon as a lever. All of that is operated from within, not outside. See how much we are repeating it. Even in solar time, a measurement of areas to torus, even in that, that's the inner controller. So all of that is space and directions. So again, it tells us, he who dwells in the moon and the stars, yet is within the moon and the stars, whom the moon and the stars do not know, whose body the moon and the stars are, who controls the moon and the stars from within. He is yourself, the inner controller, the immortal. And then he who dwells in that space that is called ether, some people will call it ether, that is, who operates within the gravitational field, who is within that, and that gravitational field, as well as the kinetic energy, as well as the radiational energy, as well as the electromagnetic field, all of this is the inner controller of all of this. And the field doesn't know it, but he occupies it and controls it from within. He who dwells in the darkness, yet is within the darkness. There's some darkness for us is light to other creatures. An owl enjoys the darkness and considers it to be light, daytime. So who the darkness does not know, whose body the darkness is, who controls this darkness from within. He is yourself, the inner controller, the immortal. And if there's darkness, what about light? Yes, he who dwells in this light, yet is within the light. We're sitting here under light. Is it easy to think that inside that, some controlling entity is that? You may call it electricity, but electricity is within a field. And doesn't matter how much you go into it, you'll find the same formula operating, the inner controller, the immortal self. And he who dwells in the light, yet is within the light, whom the light doesn't know, whose body the light is, who controls the light from within, he is yourself, the inner controller, the immortal. Thus far, the reference to the divinities. Now, what about the beings? So many examples are given, and it means that there's no such thing as any kind of distraction in meditation. You can take any object you like and drill it down into its core and find out this inner controller and find it to be the same immortal self. So we did that earlier on in a meditation. And then what about all beings? Salvebhyo, he who dwells in all beings, yet is within all beings, whom no beings know, whose body is all beings, who controls all beings from within. And it goes on to the same formula. He is yourself, inner controller, immortal. So that covers everything pretty much, all beings. But what about your own self? Then it comes down. Supposing you are sitting in your own space, and you're not seeing anything, you're not hearing anything, then what? So he who dwells in the breath, very often in meditation, a way of calming the nerves is to observe what is happening in the breathing. Not registering it necessary to this inner controller. Only registering there is breathing taking place. You go one step further. It is that inner entity that is controlling the breath from within, the inner controller. Why else would there be a rhythm? Don't think yet you're creating the rhythm. You're not taking a pair of bellows and making the breathing happening, pushing the diaphragm muscle up, relaxing it down. You don't think you're pumping the heart, squeezing it, and the heart has an intelligence of its own. It goes on holiday every moment. It's pumping and resting, pumping and resting. It gives us a good lesson. How should we operate in life? It'll work and rest, work and rest. It doesn't go off on holiday. It doesn't go to the Bahamas. It doesn't wake you up one day and say, hey, come on, I've been pumping at least once every second and odd for so many years, and I think I deserve a rest. I think I told you previously, there was one man who was a very funny comedian, and he used to enter into the stage having taken a puff of cigarette and holding it in his mouth. So before he says anything, he opens his mouth and this puff of smoke comes up. And he says, I'm a little tired. I've been breathing all day. I'm a little short of breath. That's what he says. You see, all of this can be registered to the Lord's account. Sitting there feeling the breath is happening by itself. I'm not doing it. The heart is pumping by itself. I'm not doing it. Some inner entity is doing it for me. A kind of discovery in every movement can be had in this way. And then it goes on. He who dwells in the organ of speech, yet is within speech. Very often we are offended by what people say. But the capacity for that person to speak, did we ever consider that? Did we ever register it to the Lord of the Universe's account, where He's the inner controller, enabling speech? Does it really matter what comes out of the mouth? So he who dwells in the organs of speech, because you see, when you get offended, you're assuming this is my ear. It's not. Even the ear is controlled from within, the inner controller, and it mentions that as well. The organ of speech yet is within speech, whom speech does not know, whose body speech is, who controls speech from within. He is yourself, the inner controller, the immortal. Then in the eye, he who dwells in the eye, yet is within the eye, whom the eye doesn't know, whose body the eye is, who controls the eye from within. And it goes on. He is yourself, the inner controller, the immortal. You see, if we look at the Kena Upanishad, we find an echo of this. He's the eye of the eye, see. He's the ear of the ear, and so on. Don't think it, don't register it to yourself. Now, all eyes are there. In all beings have some eyes of some kind, some senses of some kind, noses of some kind, a way of registering sound and vibration. So it's easy to trace. That entity is the inner controller, and it's not the inner controller only in that entity, in the object, in the creature. It is the same as your own inner entity. This is the emphasis here. And so it goes on to the ear, within the ear, and so on and so forth. And he who dwells in the mind, yet is within the mind, whom the mind does not know, whose body the mind is. What is the mind? Is that Lord's sitting room that He chose to occupy. Don't think that is your mind. Don't think that the only way to purify the mind is to change your mind. No. He who dwells in the skin, yet is within the skin. And of course, the skin doesn't know. No housing knows it. whose body the skin is, who controls the skin from within, and so it goes on. And then the next example would be who dwells in the understanding, the intellect, yet is within that. Shankaracharya discusses this also, and he says that the importance of the passage is in terms of the manifestation that is there, and the occupation of it is there. A spark of the divine is seen within it, according to Ramanuja and so on. And so, within the understanding, you may be tired of all these examples, probably. But the examples are there so that you can pick up anything from any place, from any object, and go within and see that same inner controller. And then it ends like this. Not only that, but everything begins from a seed. And the human seed is there. So he who dwells in the human seed is other than that, whom that seed doesn't know, whose body that seed is, who controls the seed from within. That is yourself, the inner control, the immortal self. And then he says this, he is never seen, but he is the seer. You can never see the seer. And then he goes on, he is never heard, but he is the hearer. He is never perceived, but he is the perceiver. Never thought, but he is the thinker. There is no other seer but he. There is no other hearer but he. There is no other perceiver but he. There is no other thinker but he. He is yourself, the inner controller, the immortal. And everything else is defective, is a wrong understanding. And of course, after saying all of that comprehensively, the questioner, who happens to be Udalaka Aruni, kept quiet. Right here now, people are quiet as well. Maybe half of them are asleep, I don't know. But even while sleeping, the inner controller is awake. Now the next section then is very important because it goes on that this is now the inner controller, but is there something like an unqualified Brahman going on? And so another questioner comes. Well, he makes a statement first. He says, I shall ask this person 2 questions like arrows. And if you think he cannot answer these, then consider yourself defeated and he can take the cows off. That's fair. So, a woman sage now asks a question. In the ancient days, of course, women sages and men sages, there was this equality. So her question is like this. That, O Yajnavalkya, which they say, it is above the heaven, it is beneath the earth, that which is between these two, the heaven and the earth, that which people call the past, present, and the future, across what is that woven, like warp and woof. This is a wonderful, wonderful phrase. And we have to make a comparison with modern science because we talk about the time-space fabric, the fabric of space and time. The fabric has this woven pattern. One strand goes this way, the other strand goes that way. You have a weaving machine that integrates these two, and you come out with a shirt or an item of clothing. And so these things are woven like warp and woof. Now, Einstein's relativity dealt with this pretty comprehensively, and he makes an astonishing conclusion. He says that what we call gravity or its effect is because mass is impinging on something like a fabric. We can't see it, but we can see the effects of it. And when we see the effects of it, one of it is to make a rotation. It requires mass impinging on it. And people who want to demonstrate it, something like a trampoline, and you put a heavy object on it. And because of that, you'll find something will spin around the dip that you made. Something like that. So he's saying it's a physics question, basically. And what he's saying is, and he's repeating the question by way of answering, that which is above the heaven, beneath the earth, that which is between these two, heaven and earth, that which people call the past, the present, and the future, across space, across space is that woven like warp and woof. Tremendously advanced answer. She obviously knew the answer, so she agrees, yes. So then, that of Yajnavalkya, of which they say it is above the heaven, beneath the earth, and which is between these two, heaven and earth, that which the people call past, present, and future, across what is that woven, like warp and woof? And then he answers, that which is above all this space, that which is beneath, and so on, repeats the question by way of answer. Now, it's a difficult question, actually, in a sense, because if Yajnavalkya doesn't explain it because he thinks it's inexplicable, then he's doomed. So he lays himself open to a charge of non-comprehension if he doesn't answer this question. On the other hand, he attempts to explain the inexplicable, then he'd be guilty of something like a contradiction. So he answers like this. See, now let's review. What is woven like? What is that which is above the heavens, below the earth, and so on and so forth? This is space is woven like warp and woof, the space-time continuum in modern language. What is behind that is the next question that weaves it. So he says, that of Gargi, the knowers of this supreme principle, we call it Brahman, call the imperishable. This term of Yakta, imperishable. Don't forget, when he's answering about the inner controller, he's calling it he. Now he has to call it impersonally of Yakta. So it is imperishable. Then you can't say what it is. You have to say what it's not. What is it not? Well, it's not gross. It's not fine. It's not short. It's not long. In other words, you can't measure it. It's neither glowing red like fire. You can't see it with the eyes. It's not sticky or adhesive. It has no texture like water. It's neither shadow nor darkness. Everything can be contrasted in this way. It's not that. It's neither air, it's neither space. You see, air has a characteristic of being present everywhere. Space has a characteristic of looking as if it's infinite, no boundaries. But it's not even that. It's unattached, without taste, without smell. You can't pick it up through the senses. Without eyes, without ears, without voice. In nothing that we can register with the senses or recognize as a human even. Without mind, without radiance. Without mind also. Without radiance. Without breath. Without a mouth, without measure. Having no within and no without. It eats nothing and no one eats it. The Swami eats bananas. When will the bananas eat the Swami? Not a good question. So, what are you left with? That's the difficulty. You can't describe something except in terms of negation. And our concept of God doesn't meet this. This is something beyond that. This is why Meister Eckhart had these two terms, God and Godhead. And you can say that is this God is this inner controller. But when you come to what is behind all of that, all this warp and woof, behind space and time, behind our physics, and yet manifesting through that, indescribable. You can't measure it. So, this passage brings out that the imperishable is neither a substance, it doesn't possess any attributes. How can we come to grips with it? Truly, at the command of that imperishable, he replies, he continues, O Gargi, the sun and the moon stand in their respective positions. Something like a presence that enables that to stand in their positions. At the command of that imperishable O Gargi, heaven and earth stand in their respective positions. How can it command if it has no mouth? So it's only a convenience term. That is by its presence, by its commanding presence, you might say. These things work. And at the command of that imperishable, what are called moments in time, moments, hours, days, nights, half months, months, seasons, years, stand in their respective positions as registered by us. When we see all this, the zodiac moving and the sun in relation to that, and the moon in relation to that, and measuring all of that from our perspective, all of that operates because of its presence. At the command of that imperishable one, some rivers flow to the east from the white snowy mountains, see their understanding of geography at the time, and to the west in whatever direction each flows, and by the command of that imperishable, men praise those who give all the great luminous forces of nature that we call the devas, who are desirous of the sacrifice, and the fathers are desirous of their offering, all of these things that we use to make the world a better place. At the command of that, all these things are flowing. And whosoever in this world, without knowing this imperishable, performs these, what we call religions, religious sacrifice, worship, performs austerities for 1,000 years, his work will have no end. Without knowing this imperishable, in other words, you'll continue doing what you're doing, no matter how noble your actions are. If you do not know this imperishable one. And so, O Gargi, without knowing this imperishable, departs from this world, is pitiable. Pitiable because they don't find any permanent solutions. They're simply doing what they've always been doing, and they're going round and round and round, not getting out of it, not finding a practical formula. You have to transcend the world. And you do this by the previous passage. What is the previous passage? Seeing that entity as the inner controller in everything, and registering it as your own immortal self, your own inner controller, and doing that with great creative imagination. Imagining, as I began this talk from the start, before the earth was, what was standing there? And then that wove a cocoon, a home, a housing around itself. Very beautiful idea. So those people who depart like that will be pitiable, but O Gargi, he continues, he who knowing the imperishable departs from this world is a true Brahmana, that is a knower of Brahman. Truly that imperishable is unseen, but is the seer, repeating it. Therefore important. Is unheard, but is the hearer. Unthought, but is the thinker. Unknown, but is the knower. When I say that it is the witness, when I say that it is the knower and the thinker, it is derived from this passage. Do you remember when I draw a big diagram? See? And I put the witness outside of it, making the first diagram a kind of a bubble where I operate independently, caught up, not knowing this imperishable, operating then as action and reaction with the world around me, thinking that the controller is beyond it, not within it. And when I understand it's within it, then I also come to a position that this entity, this immortal self, is the witness, the knower, the thinker. It comes from this passage. There is no other seer but this, anywhere. There is no other hearer than this. There is no other thinker but this. You think that you're thinking, you think that you have your individual mind, you think that you are clever, you think that you are somebody who can analyze something and make your own decisions and all this with your individual mind. No. You have something like an individual substation, a transistor, and there's a vast broadcasting corporation. And if there are 1,000 radios all around in an area, don't think that they are getting a broadcast individually by DHL delivery. It's not happening. They're simply tuning in to a one cosmic broadcast. Only one entity is there. There's only one cosmic mind. But this imperishable Gargi is space. By this is space woven like warp and woof. That's his final answer. Like that program, final answer. Final answer, that's the final answer. She said, Venerable Brahmanas, you may think it's a great thing if you get off from him, though bowing to him. Not one of you will defeat him in arguments about Brahman. And thereupon, this Gargi, that is Vachanavi, kept silent. The unconditioned self, being beyond speech and mind, undifferentiated and one, is defined really as not this, not this. We can't assert what it is, but we can discover it by discovering its presence as the inner control in all things, and having that special eye and using that repeated formula continuously. So this gives us a wonderful practical way of accessing this by noticing everything that we observe and registering it and using it as a kind of preordained thing. What was standing there before what we see existed? Something was there. What was it? How did it become manufactured? And who's occupying it? And do we notice it? And by noticing it, it means feel it. Do we feel it? Do we register it? Does it lead us to a sense of adoration, wonder, and thankfulness? Whichever part of the body we have, we can see it's entered into it. And this, whatever the reply was only a sample, because a million billion things are there. And we can take any one that comes into the mind. And not knowing it because it's imperishable, it's inconceivable, we have to use the capacity of our creative imagination and try to find out what was the precondition, whether it is a tree, whether it's a flower, whether it's the moon, whether it's the sun, whether it's the breath, whether it's the mind, whether it's the eye, whether it's the ear, whether it's speech. Instead of taking umbrage when somebody speaks, the wonder of speech itself, that entity is driven by an inner controller from within. And it is your own immortal self, not somebody else's, your own immortal self. If you understand this, of course, what wars will ever be there? If you understand it's the same immortal self everywhere. What arguments will be there? What hatred will be there? What disagreements will be there? What resentment will be there? What jealousy will be there? None of it will exist. So this is a wonderful formula that can be repeated, taken from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. It's a formula that can be absolutely repeated, and it means that there is no such thing as any distraction in meditation. Whatever comes can be led to that. I often think, and I may have said many times, a small story, true story, there was a devotee in Zimbabwe who bought a house. She's an architect. And from her place that she specifically designed as a state-of-the-art property, she could see in the early morning the hills in the distance. And when you say hills, what we call in Ireland mountains, what we call hills in Africa. A beautiful, beautiful scene. Temperature, wonderful temperature. The winter in Zimbabwe is about the same as the summer in Ireland. And her shrine that she could go to, say at 5 o'clock in the morning on sunrise, she'd carved something out of a rock and with gates and so on. So she could go outside and sit there. It was always warm. I asked her one day, how's your meditation? She says, oh, terrible. It's a struggle. Here's a person who's living in a kind of paradise, in an ideal ashram kind of situation, amongst forest areas, the African bush, with mountains in the distance, and glorious, glorious sunrises and sunsets. There are no sunrises and sunsets as you will find in Africa. And she can't meditate? No, what is the problem? Well, when I sit down, as I sit down, tuck, 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 the borehole pump starts. But you see, the borehole pump is a sound that has to travel through the air. Sound waves have to travel to the air. And you can set up a rhythm. Can you not say it's Om? Can you not say that it's vibration everywhere? Can you not take that and find out the inner controller, your own immortal self within it? It's not a simple thing to hear something. The noise has to be made. Two things have to contact each other. It has to travel through the air as a series of waves. These audio waves at a certain frequency that the ear can pick up, allows the inner ear to vibrate, a kind of tympanum, and then a whole neurological system gets set into motion. And a memory that identifies it is this sound. All happening in a few instances, few seconds. What a wonderful thing it is. But this passage says that it is in the ear, is the inner controller, and in the sound, and in the media that carries it. You have inexhaustible material for meditation. So there are no such things as distractions in meditation. Everything is a subject for it. So we leave it there. Thank you.